Now that you have some basic animation theory, you're ready to start creating keyframes and creating your own animation inside Maya. So we're going to start with a simple exercise, which is a bouncing ball. This is commonly used by animation students to get started. So in Maya, what I can do is create a primitive sphere and animate that. So I'll go to Create and make myself a NURB sphere. Now for this exercise, I'm just going to work in the front window. We're not going to worry about the perspective in this case. So first thing I do is figure out where the sphere starts. So I'll move the sphere up in the air. We're going to animate the ball starting here, dropping, bouncing off this virtual ground plane, and coming to rest back at this position. Now before I set a keyframe, I do need to check two things. First thing I need to do is check my frame rate. So I'm going to go up to Window, Settings, Preferences, and double check that. Go to Settings, take a look at Time. Now by default it's set to 24. In this case, I think I'll set it to 30 and work in 30 frames per second. So just double check your frame rate so you know what you're working in. Once you set that, you can hit the Save button to save that. Second thing you do is determine the duration of your animation. How long do you want your animation to be? Let's say I want it to be 60 frames long. I'll enter 60 over here in this right cell in the range slider, and enter 1 on the left. Then I'll pull my center gray bar so it runs the same duration. So basically it should say 1, 1, 60, 60. So now the animation goes from frame 1 to frame 60. So now I have my start position, and I have my frames per second correct, and also my range slider and time slider set up with the correct duration. I can start to keyframe. So how do you keyframe? Well, first you need to make sure that you're on the correct frame number where you want to set a keyframe. So for example, if I want to set a keyframe in frame 1, I have to make sure my time slider is on 1. Next thing you do is to go to the animation menu set, go to Animate, and go to Set Key. Now there is an option you should check on Set Key. There's two ways it operates. So if I go to Set Key and look at the option box, you can take a look. There's two ways that you can set keys, and it says Set Keys At. One is current time, and the other is prompt. Current time is the default. We're going to start with that. Later on, we'll get the prompt. So right now, I'm going to make sure it's at the current time and hit Apply. And close that. In fact, that has actually set my first keyframe. And there is a keyframe because you can see a red line down here on frame 1, and also my channel box is red. Now you don't have to actually go into that menu item to set a keyframe. There's actually a default hotkey that applies the same tool, and that's the S key. So if you hit the S key, it sets a keyframe on whatever frame you're at on the timeline. And that's if it's set the current time like we looked at in the option box, which it is right now. So now we have a keyframe set for frame 1. Now I can scrub the timeline to a different frame. Let's say I want the ball to hit the ground at frame 15. I'd move my timeline to frame 15, then move my sphere to where I want it to be on the ground, like right here. And while it's on frame 15, my ball's in the correct place, I can set another keyframe. Now this time I'll use the hotkey. If I press S on the keyboard, it sets a new keyframe. I can tell because a new red line is dropped down here. And if I scrub back and forth, I can see the ball falls. So I set one keyframe here on 1 and one on 15. I can go further on the timeline and give it a bounce. Maybe I want to bounce up at frame 20. I'd go to frame 20 on the timeline, move it up in the air to represent that peak of that bounce. Now I'll press the S key again. S key. I get another keyframe laid down. So now I have 3 keyframes. One at 1, one at 15, and one at 20. So now I have a really simple animation. Starts here, it falls, it bounces, and goes this high in the air. Now I need to have it hit the ground. So now I'll go to frame 25. I'll pull this down to the ground, and set another keyframe by hitting S. S key, another keyframe. Now I can continue to add additional positions. If I wanted to have additional smaller bounces, I could do that. I can go to frame 30, give a smaller bounce, like go a little bit higher up in the air, and set another keyframe. Go forward again, and get it back on the ground again. And set a keyframe. So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 keyframes. Now I can play it back. In fact, I'll turn on shading so we can see it, smooth shade all, and play it back. So there's your animation. Now, it's not overly exciting at this point, but there are ways to adjust your keyframes to make the animation more aesthetic. And of course, you can add keyframes at later points. At any point, I can go back and pick the sphere. Now, it is important that the thing you're animating is selected. You can only apply a keyframe to the object that's selected at the time. You also have to make sure that you're on the correct frame on the timeline when you want to set a keyframe. So let's say I want to set one more keyframe at frame 50. I need to move to frame 50 while the sphere is selected and pick a new position. Now I'm just moving now, but you're free to rotate or scale. So maybe I'll rotate the sphere at this point and even scale it up. And then now I can set another keyframe by pressing S. So now the ball bounces a few times and rolls over on its side and grows larger. Now maybe a ball really wouldn't do that in real life, but that's an option you have. You can animate in any fashion that you want. So you can add keyframes at any point, and you can write over old keyframes. You can go to where existing keyframe happens to be, like say frame 20, move it into a new position while it's on frame 20, and by pressing S again, you will have overwritten the old keyframe with a new keyframe. So if you keyframe over the top of an old keyframe, the old keyframe goes away, and a new position, rotation, and scale is memorized by the program. So now that's a new position for frame 20. So now I have a little bit more complex animation. Now, the way we've been animating is animating with the current frame on the timeline. Again, if you go to Animate, go to Set Key and look at the option box, that's because Set Keys Add is set the current time. So when you animate in this fashion, you always have to be careful to look at the timeline to make sure your time slider is at the correct frame for you to place a keyframe there. But you're free to place a keyframe wherever you want. It could be on any number you want. You could place a keyframe at frame 7 if you want. It doesn't really matter. Whatever you think works for the animation. Now, one thing to keep in mind is how far apart the keyframes are, because that determines the speed of an object. If the sphere is here on frame 1 and here on frame 15, that means that sphere takes 15 frames to fall from here to there. That's a half a second. 30 frames per second, 15 frames is half a second. That means by placing the keyframes that far apart, you've made that motion last 1/2 of a second. If you want the ball to drop faster, you have to place a keyframe closer together. In other words, instead of making this keyframe at frame 15, you might place it at frame 7. So that way the ball would fall between frame 1 and frame 7. And when it covers a greater distance in a shorter number of frames, it's faster. Of course, the opposite is slower. If you want the ball to drop slower, I'd spread the keyframes apart. So maybe it starts at frame 1 and hits the ground at frame 30. That's 30 frames it takes to fall, so therefore it's slower. Something to keep in mind is the distance the keyframes are apart affects the speed of the object as it moves. We'll return to the bouncing ball animation and go over that in greater detail because there's a lot of things you can do to edit the animation to fine-tune it.